What's going on, guys? It's Maddy Hudak, and it is full-fledged allergy season here in New Orleans. So if I sound a little hoarse or a little phlegmy or have to hack something up during this first episode, my sincerest apologies in advance. But welcome to the first episode of Before the Whistle. As I said in my intro, I wear a lot of hats in this industry, but being Tulane sideline reporter over the last 2 seasons might be my favorite one. I had this first episode all mapped out, ready to go, and then the draft happened. One of my favorite players that I think I'll ever get the chance to watch up close, running back Tajay Spears, became the highest drafted Tulane player since Matt Forte in 2008 when he was taken at number 81 overall by Tennessee. I'm sitting there and that's setting in, realizing, someone that I truly know and love is in the NFL. And then 10 picks later, linebacker Dorian Williams gets chosen by Buffalo. There are 21 schools that produced top 100 picks in the 2023 NFL draft this year. 19 of those are Power 5 teams. The other 2, Notre Dame and Tulane. 2 players that I watched claw their way from 2-10 to 12-2 to Cotton Bowl MVPs to the Senior Bowl, gone in the 3rd round. And while I won't derail this entire episode with Tulane coverage, these last 2 seasons have really changed how I look at the sport. It's somewhat weird feeling this locked in to college football after really not caring much about it for 27 years. I really never used to watch the draft at all. And I still have gripes with it being the length of a Shakespearean play. But then as I started to cover the Saints, I tune in when it looked like a trade might be likely and the team was on the clock. Suddenly find myself sitting on my hands this year, unable to pry myself from the television all weekend because I had this new emotional stake in it. And quite frankly, it was stressful. I actually texted an agent that I had met during the Senior Bowl, like, you guys feel like this every year with your guys? By the end of day 2 of the draft, I'm suddenly vested in the Tennessee Titans and the Buffalo Bills. By the end of the draft process, I added 9 new teams that I want to pay attention to next season. The 10th story, one of my favorites, is one that continued locally here after the draft ended. The Saints signed linebacker Nick Anderson from Tulane as one of their undrafted free agents. Nick stands taller than anyone I know at 5'9", which is not the NFL prototype for an inside linebacker. But I have yet to see a mountain that Nick can't climb. And really, there's no better story, I think, that illustrates this sport than the underdog chasing and achieving his dreams. And those are the stories that I really want to tell on this show. You could find football coverage out there for almost any angle. Some only want to hear about their favorite NFL team and perhaps their division. Most of us love the NFL draft, but for some college fans, as I've learned, that's really the only aspect of the NFL they care to hear about. Perhaps it's the X's and O's for you, or just the happenings of the NFL as a whole. So why this show? It's a fair ask. I broke into this industry quite chaotically and really without a game plan. I started out as a writer. I asked myself one question each time I sat down at my keyboard. Why this story? There's enough Monday morning quarterbacks out there to discuss the outcome of games. I always felt like it did a disservice to everything that goes on outside the 60-minute game clock. And while I love football in its purest form, I've come to learn that more often than not, life imitates sports. Sure, it's a game of scheming, personnel, strategy, but most importantly, it's about human beings. That includes the players, the coaches, the entire staffs of these organizations, and those that cover the sport. So here's a little about me as a person. I grew up in the Bay Area with a dad from Cleveland and a mom from New Orleans. And if you did a double take at my last name earlier in the intro, you'd be unsurprised to hear I chose to grow up a Saints fan. At first, the game meant little to nothing to me outside of getting to wear my Deuce McAllister jersey on Sundays. And then I'm in 6th grade and Hurricane Katrina hits. I didn't really have the capacity at that age, especially from far away, to really grasp what happened here. And so I flew down with my mom in December of that year to volunteer at a dog shelter and in a warehouse packing school supplies for children. I came to understand PTSD probably way too young, watching the reactions of dogs at the shelter when it started raining. And I came to realize how valuable just a backpack full of school supplies is, but also how meaningless it feels when those children have no school to go to. I'm staring at these X markings on streets, which we've all gravely come to interpret. I'm staring at them because they're in the middle of the street next to an overturned boat. It was just ugly and desolate. And even I could understand that at that age. But then when Steve Gleason blocked that punt in the first game for the Saints back in the Superdome, I saw beauty in tragedy and how you can find it in the sport. When I was on Bourbon Street after the Saints won the Super Bowl with hundreds of thousands, I really saw firsthand that sports can genuinely change people's lives. And most recently, I saw that college football offers its own unique sense of magic when Tulane won the Cotton Bowl, but more on that one in a bit. Eventually, I came to see football as a bonding experience between my dad and me as an only child. We kind of enjoyed a wider lens of discussion, philosophically, coaching traits, building a championship game. And I just kind of learned to love the game as a whole. And I remember the summer before I went off to college, he bought me my first copy of Take Your Eye Off the Ball, which I highly recommend to everyone out there as recommended reading. I would read that on the plane on my way to Tulane University in 2012, where I spent the next 4 years obtaining my bachelor's of science to become a clinical psychologist. And then I went into jury consulting. And then I made the hard switch to law while getting my master's in legal studies, thinking, okay, I guess I'll become a prosecutor now. Law was always something that was in the back of my head. My family all works in the field, and my brain really works in a way conducive to being in the field of law. But I learned that I was accumulating these wonderful skills. And I think that they translate through all of those industries and really help me out here. Now, I learned how to have a true investigative mindset and what that looks like when you're looking at it from a legal psychology perspective and strictly a legal one. I learned probably how to do a disturbing amount of deep dive research, but really I learned how to analyze things from every angle. And that skill set has served me well. But it just never felt right. I always felt like I was aimlessly wandering in the dark. I had always been this person that was so sure that I knew where I was going. And I'm on career path number 3, and I'm really no closer to figuring out what I'm meant to do than when I graduated Tulane in 2016. And I know I'm still young. I'm only 29 now, but it's just a scary feeling when you feel like you can't find or don't know what your calling is. So I have all these skills. I really enjoy these industries. I just don't feel like they're going towards the right thing or something I cared about doing. And then I get laid off during the pandemic. And frankly, it's probably the best thing that's ever happened to me. Rather than job search and look for, again, another meaningless job, I took a step back, decided to look inward, and I investigated myself. What was I missing? Football didn't pop up in my head in lights or anything, but I had recently started writing on the side about the Saints just as a way to kind of quell my mental boredom that was really just consuming me in my previous careers. I figured take advantage of the opportunity to pursue a known passion of mine, which what I thought I was chasing at the time was writing. And I still love to write, and it's still a passion of mine, but I realized that the dream was the sport itself. I was never really expecting to find myself on sports talk radio after that and really loving every minute. I was asked to first come on the Sports Hangover with Gus Kattengale, which is a local 3-hour radio show here in New Orleans, ironically for the first time to put my master's degree to use when I came on to break down the legal ramifications of Marshawn Lattimore's possession of a stolen gun charge. That kind of turned into a more frequent guest spot where I bided my time in Philadelphia against my better judgment. And I'll keep repeating this, and it's really the theme of this podcast and this show, but it's all about human beings in this sport and in this industry. So I met the Pelicans play caller, Todd Graffinini, on Twitter during the pandemic, and he saw something in me. He and my family both pushed me to move down to New Orleans and really make a go at this, whatever it might be. I finally took their advice in March of 2021, but I landed here and I had literally no game plan, but quite frankly, that might have been what I needed to have happen. As someone that always thought I was so sure and knew what I was doing and had these arbitrary timelines in my head, it was kind of nice to genuinely not have a clue. I started to come in with Gus into the studio to co-host the Sports Hangover on a more regular basis. still not sure what I'm doing or where I'm going. But for the first time, the now felt good. I always joke with people I know about growing up as a theater kid, which might come as a surprise to some. My previously booming singing voice was ruined by vocal nodules, but I also had a brief stint as a child actor, if you will, that culminated in me being in a hamburger commercial and being dubbed over on a Japanese television show. But the acting classes that I took in cold camera reading and improv, which anyone listening out there that's looking to get a leg up in this industry or really figure out how to differentiate yourself, improv. It paid off 15 years later when I sat in that same studio and hosted a 3-hour show alone in June of 2021. That was really the first sense of genuine career accomplishment that I felt. It's not easy to fill the silence with nothing but your voice in an industry you're not necessarily seen as an authority in yet. And that happens a lot to women in sports in general. I'm not here to stand on a soapbox or come from a woe is me perspective, especially not in my opening episode. I bring up being a woman in sports as a position of strength. I gained that perspective as I grew into my own as Tulane sideline reporter over the last 2 seasons. Up until the summer of 2021, I felt nothing but career hits and existential crises 6 ways to Sunday. I've always been a passionate, curious, intelligent student and person, but always described as having a lot of potential. And as a lot of people who are described that way know, the potential never seemed to truly translate into something. I keep saying, and I still believe that one of my top skills is writing, but I was failing English my sophomore year of high school because I could not for the life of me read Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, a book written in a time where books were published as chapters weekly in newspapers, and there was quite literally nothing but financial incentive to write a book to death. If I can skip 50 pages and still understand what's going on, I'm going to be honest, it's your novel that's the problem. But I had a D in a class that I was supposed to excel in because I was failing every reading quiz despite getting high marks on my papers. And my teacher, Mr. Daniels, he didn't have to help me the way that he did at all, but he believed in me and my writing and told me I was one of the few he was recommending for AP English, despite getting a B in his class because all my papers were graded as A's. He was actually the teacher I asked to read my college essay. He ripped up the first draft in my face and gave me one of the shreds with a sentence circled on it. And I quote, "This was crap, but this sentence is your story. Write that one." That essay, which was on a child that I tutored who had Asperger's, it's not the only reason I got into Tulane. But he was right that my first copy would have been thrown in the trash. Because while I didn't realize it at the time, I identified with that student's struggles because I had been learning to cope with my own since first grade. That was when my teacher, Mrs. Laurinette, noticed that I was showing signs of ADHD and really was the only teacher who ever explicitly recognized the obvious. I wasn't extremely disruptive or anything, but enough so at a long table of 7-year-olds that eventually she sat me alone facing the wall in front of a poster full of all the presidents. She recommended to my parents that I be tested for ADHD, but I just didn't fit the mold. In 2001, there was an obvious type of ADHD, and it's one we're all familiar with. The boy who keeps interrupting class is extremely distracting to those around him, and those struggles usually show in their friend groups, in their home life, and most likely in their grades. I was naturally smart. I could read by the time I was 3, and I read at a 3rd grade level in kindergarten. Quite honestly, that covered up a lot of blind spots that eventually I learned to cope with. Being seated in the corner by myself was one of the few lifelines that I remember being given. It helped me learn to be comfortable with the thoughts swirling in my brain from different directions. It was the first time I remembered being able to focus. But I was ultimately fighting a losing battle inside my head, which is where my hyperactivity lied, and I just didn't understand it. I didn't present as a fidgety kid unable to sit still. But my mind might as well have been in Siberia half the time. Women generally tend to mask symptoms, especially of ADHD, because we realize eventually we're not going to get any help. So we come up with coping mechanisms for being inattentive and distracted, like my physical timer I have on my desk, or The Post-it notes taped to my phone, taped to my mirror, on every single door as I'm ready to leave. So many failed attempts at planners. Watching how others behave in social environments and trying to mirror how they act. Oftentimes choosing silence over the inexplicable urge to interrupt. Being seen as the gifted kid who has so much potential if only they chose to apply it, that we're not using our brains to its fullest. And if only we work harder, just focus and stop being lazy, we'll obtain this magic beans cure for what we refuse to call a problem. Relying on our natural intelligence to get us as far as it gets us. I didn't realize that I literally had no idea how to study until college hit me like a train. I really could have done so much better in school. Well, I know it doesn't really matter much anymore, but it bothered me for a long time. And it wasn't until a concussion led to my diagnosis at 25 that I finally solved this lifelong riddle. That I graduated with a sole A minus as my worst grade in my master's program wasn't a coincidence to me, because that's by the time I was diagnosed. I share all this because with this podcast, you're getting the full scale experience of me as a human being. And a lot of who I am is my ADHD. I might rant at times, go on some tangents, delve into some rabbit holes that might seem a little extra. But while it might be described as a disorder with an inability to focus, it's really that we have too much focus and just don't know how or where to apply it. That gave way to strength eventually. The daydreaming inspired creativity, and the millions of thoughts finally streamlined to something called hyperfocusing. Something that allows me to research an entire topic and write 4,000 words on it for 10 hours straight without blinking or getting up. A lifelong weakness for me eventually became something I could pull strength from. That's not to say it doesn't affect me negatively in a ton of aspects still, but it actually helps me navigate this chaotic career field. It's given me a lot of empathy and understanding for others. It implored me to look into the context of things. Because if you took me at face value for most of my life, well, you were looking at the wrong picture, or an overly cropped version that just doesn't tell the whole story. That play sucked might be a fair statement, but it doesn't help the conversation at all. It doesn't tell the whole story or really any story. Was that player out of position? Or did they make the correct read and just miss the tackle? Was it, linebacker taking over a nickelback's duties due to an in-game injury that shifted several players over and perhaps has multiple of them playing at their weak spots? Is there something going on in that player's life? Are they coming back from an injury? Are they being communicated to and taught the best way that they retain and learn? It's not that I want to discuss these things. It's that I can't help but obsess over the why more often than not. It's what my brain has done my whole life. It eventually led to me being banned from asking hypothetical questions in first grade. But I think I could help you. I could help teach you guys to look at all the angles. And I'm not talking about all 22. I find that more valuable than stating the obvious as a spectator of a professional sport I've never played a down of in my life. I think a lot of guys take their football experience growing up for granted. Maybe if I had an older brother who played, or at least played video games, so I could have grown up playing Madden. But I wasn't into video games. I was into reading books in my tree outside my house. I think it's fair to wonder about my credentials covering a sport I never played and never went to school for, and nothing in broadcast journalism or anything of the sort. Psychology and law is where I came from. So I became a student of the game through the Scouting Academy last year. And it was the best and hardest decision I've made in this career path. And I'll admit, there is a steep learning curve that humbled me, and I'm still getting through it and learning. It's something I've taken through every profession, is the ability to break down complex topics in a way that's understandable to everyone. And that's what I'm going to strive to do on this show with my analysis. And as I'm still learning, I'll take you guys along for the ride with me. There's something I'll say about studying football and learning in general. Apply it to your life experiences. Maybe you played football, or maybe you didn't. When I was studying the defensive back positions, I struggled with getting down the different coverages. Until I thought back to my time playing soccer. It's apples to oranges in how the games are played, but how the defense is made up isn't really all that different. So there's typically 4 defenders in soccer. Picture those as your 2 cornerbacks and your 2 safeties. I had written an article last offseason about the philosophical switch for the Saints at safety under head coach Dennis Allen, who values more interchangeable safeties that can complement one another and work in tandem. And Sean Payton liked his prototypal 3 safety and strong safety. So to keep it simple, think of Dennis Allen's safeties as cover 2, where they split the middle of the field. And Sean Payton's safeties as cover 3. Malcolm Jenkins down to the box and Marcus Williams roaming deep in the middle of the field. In the early days of soccer, you play what's known as diamond defense, and that's precisely how it sounds. Your fullbacks are your cornerbacks on their respective sides, and you have a stopper and a sweeper. I was a stopper. That's your box safety. Aggressively halt advances, pursue and win almost every tackle. Your sweeper is your free safety. Last line of defense, had to be able to clear it, have that range and a long speed with good eye tracking abilities to have that right reaction time to balls in the air. And again, that all ties into that trait known as range in free safeties. And eventually we move to what you see in the pros in the EPL, which is what's called a flat 4 defense. That's a more fluid line that's zone based and focused on shutting down angles in space. So instead of a stopper and sweeper, you got your 2 center backs. And they have to kind of seamlessly communicate and really organize both the offensive and the defensive attacks. It's where it differs from football, but those are interchangeable safeties that you're looking for in cover 2. My time in soccer taught me a lot. It taught me how to lead, how to compete, how to communicate, and how to apply those insights to life. And now football. I often find injury discussions cringeworthy and pretty dismissive of their gravity and what's a true competitive mindset. Sure, some players sit out for contract-related reasons. That happens all the time. But it's not a great argument to apply to every injury-riddled player. Some injuries that might seem negligent to you can be absolutely debilitating. Something as simple as pulling your hamstring can take you out entirely. I've had several of them. The recovery from concussions, in terms of the neurological effects, it's not remotely discussed enough in context of the sport, even when a player is considered to be healed. I've had several, and I had one bad one. It happened outside of sports, but it affected my vision because of the place that I hit my head. And I ended up actually having to go to eye therapy, which was fascinating. And I might share that experience one day to retrain my eyes to converge on a point because I was having issues with depth perception. And I still wear glasses to this day as a result. It was eye-opening, if you will, to how complicated that road to recovery truly is. But I always make sure to not just look through a biased lens of only my own experiences. As I said before, I do my research. I did so in an article on concussions I wrote last year. I studied the anatomy of our spines and what lumbar nerves are to offer insight into Jameis Winston's back injury last season. I'm the person who reads medical papers on topics I'm unfamiliar with to bring that perspective to football. A person who also happens to be a walking disaster and has suffered nearly every injury of the sun and have 6 respective wrist braces in my drawer to go prove it. The Scouting Academy taught me the X's and O's. But my time on the sideline at Tulane has taught me the game of football and what it takes to win. How to build a championship team. How to overcome adversity. How much human beings matter to this game. And the value women bring to the sport. Now, I'm certainly not the most emotional person out there, but for something that's kind of viewed negatively, I've really learned how to channel it. I remember a study I read in my applied social psychology class at Tulane about women in high positions in their given profession. It talked about the paradox they face to either be seen as likable or competent, but rarely, if ever, both at once. That might hold true in other professions, and I've certainly seen it happen in this one. But while on the sideline at Tulane, I feel free from any type of barriers. In fact, I feel like an asset. And that's a credit to the players, the program, and my broadcast crew, and the coaches. Sideline reporters are often seen as the throwaway job or just kind of the fluff. I've been lucky to work with my team of Corey Glore and Steve Barrios, who truly see me as an equal third to their team. And what that did is it allowed me to walk into fall camp from day one and do what I do best. Be observant. I notice the little things. I have a really good long-term memory. My working one is shot from my concussion, but I remember my 3-year-old birthday party. I remember the details, little nuggets along the way of insights players and coaches have told me. And I'm glad I walked in with absolutely no experience. It let me learn how to find myself on the sideline. And as a reporter, genuinely connect with these guys and really fall in love with the sport itself. I've had players talk to me about their mental health struggles, their feelings throughout the draft process, life adversities, their mental recovery from injury, their families, how they grew up. And through attending practice daily for 2 seasons, I've seen the effects of these players' lives and how they play on Saturdays, the good, the bad, and the ugly. But you couldn't learn more about winning football, played by champions, and life itself than you get with Tulane. These last 2 seasons, witnessing the greatest single season turnaround in college football history, it's moved me past sports. And what it's taught me is how many things have to take place before the snap, before the game plan matters at all. I've seen how true that is in daily practice, in our broadcast meetings with head coach Willie Fritz, and in the meeting rooms I've been honored to join and learn from. But I've also seen it between snaps on the sideline. I got to tell you, it's been exhilarating. As I said, sideline reporters often aren't given much credit for their role. I learned that if you're in the right place, surrounded by the right people, any job is what you make it. So I planted myself right in the action. I drove up 5 hours to Birmingham after being evacuated in Florida from Hurricane Ida and stayed with the team for 2 games in a renovated hotel with no weight room, no locker room, no kitchen, no amenities. I've heard players looking back describing that as their favorite point of the 2021 season. And at first, I could not comprehend thinking fondly of blow drying your football uniform in the ballroom and eating a Subway sandwich for the 10th day in a row. But Tulane has really taught me to search for beauty in the ugliest type of situations. And college football isn't somewhere where I really ever saw myself, if I'm being honest. When I went to Tulane, my first 2 years, they played in the Superdome, and it was as underwhelming as people have said. I missed Yeoman's inaugural season abroad in Cape Town my junior year. And I saw the makings of a foundation my final year as a student in that on-campus stadium, but the team was missing its biggest piece, head coach Willie Fritz. Any job is what you make it, but it all goes back to the business of human beings. I wasn't aware of how much access I was awarded by Coach Fritz until someone pointed out that they had seen on television that I was standing inside the bench area with the players. That's usually team-only territory. Tulane is just different. They never blinked once. I'm an introverted only child who sits in my home office every day alone, quite frankly, with joy. And sideline reporting is certainly a job for extroverts. It's pushed me out of my comfort zone, and I'm grateful to the players I cover who've made it so easy to grow this confident. In my sophomore season, I made the role my own. In my initial conversations with the voice of the Wave, Corey Glore, he told me he wanted my reporting to have teeth. And with a year of the Scouting Academy under my belt, I started to really see the value of my vantage point. My duties include finding Coach Fritz at halftime for a quick report before he heads to the locker room and tracking down information about injuries and the like. Everything else was left up to me. I started creeping closer to in-game meetings on the sidelines. And as the crowds grew at Yeoman last season, there went my ability to hear a word until I really joined the huddles. So I did. And again, Tulane never blinked. I noticed personnel changings and pairings that indicate a certain scheme or coverage, especially in the secondary. I point out when they moved to dime defense and how the safeties shifted when they run out 3 linebacker sets. I observe that an incredible run by Tajay Spears only happens due to a key block in the backfield. I report how position coaches are changing or sticking with the strategy and how they're communicating that to the players. I pay attention to how the players are communicating with each other. I pay really keen attention to my gut feeling, and that helps most often on a change of momentum. The first time I really felt that strongly was in Tulane's deafening win at Kansas State last season. That day in Bill Snyder Stadium was the first time I realized how different a win feels on the sideline than in the press box, which has its own benefits. It's actually much easier to analyze the game and see it from that viewpoint. And it took me several games and probably over a season at that point to figure out where my best vantage point was, depending which unit was on the field. But it's so much more than 60 minutes of action down there. It's handing our former defensive coordinator my sweat towel to wipe his entire head as we withered away in the Kansas heat. I'm running in circles amidst near heat stroke after noticing Nick Anderson is missing. So is Dorian Williams. Where is Larry Brooks and Lemmy Young? And I'm tracking someone down to tell me where the heck our entire starting defense went. It was for IVs in the locker room. I felt that same adrenaline in Houston 2 weeks later. I'm in the huddle with players screaming, Nick Anderson forced that fumble. I kneeled in the end zone, mere feet from Tajay's hands in his overtime game-winning touchdown catch. A snapshot in time that I will forever cherish as a millisecond where I knew we won the game before anyone else, except for maybe Tajay. I saw how much it means to have true grit in their final stretch of the season. I learned along the way how much crowd atmosphere matters. You can catch me screaming and jumping around like a madman at Yeoman Stadium on third down. I was just so anxiety riddled in Cincinnati. I wanted it as badly as these players. I'm getting hosed down with a Gatorade bottle in a circle of them as the clock winded down on the championship game, jumping up and down. I'm running like a Tasmanian devil in panic in the masses that descended onto the field afterwards, trying to find someone to interview. I'm crying and hugging Jarius Monroe as he thanks me for being there every step of the way. Then the Cotton Bowl happened, that's where I witnessed what it means to be true champions. I'm standing on the end zone directly across from the USC player who fumbled out of bounds at the 1-yard line. I'm on the bench screaming at our fans who grew quiet that don't they dare give up on a team that's never quit on themselves, spotting one of our former strength coaches, Justin Smith, screaming back at me from the stands. I'm holding our wide receiver, Fat Watts' hand on that same bench on the team's 4th and 10 conversion in that final drive. I'm sprinting to the logo in the middle of the field in full-blown shock and tears. Tulane won the Cotton Bowl during regulation, but they made themselves champions before they ever stepped foot in AT&T Stadium. I watched how a legacy is built. Tulane's fight through adversity and belief in each other as a brotherhood is the definition of mental toughness. They never cared if they were on the road. In fact, they straight up thrived. They didn't care that they won 2 games last season. They didn't flinch at a 32 home game winning streak. They didn't quit when they were down 15 points with 4 minutes remaining against the active Heisman Trophy winner. And to quote Nick Anderson in his pregame speech, because at the beginning of the season, nobody believed in us but the people in this room. And now we're here. That lonely group of 5 team in the New Year's Six just produced 10 NFL players, 2 taken in day 2 and 8 undrafted free agency signings. There's one last experience that I want to share in closing. Co-hosting Tulane's Pro Day on ESPN+. We were one of 11 schools in the country to televise that day. And the last time that we'd all collectively stepped onto Yeoman Stadium was the championship game. So our next and final time was really special on March 16th. Corey Glore and myself, 10 prospects, and all 32 NFL teams clearly there for a reason. I've been lucky to witness history. The year that'll be looked back on where everything changed for Tulane. While only 2 players were drafted in the 7 rounds, all it takes is one shot. Post-draft rookie free agency is really where you find the diamonds in the rough. For Saints fans, that's included Rashid Shaheed and Taysom Hill, Juwan Johnson in recent years, Deontay Hardy, Chris Ivory, and really most notably, Pierre Thomas. That pool now includes Nick Anderson. And I can't wait to keep telling his story. I'm the luckiest person in the world for the chance to watch something so magical unfold from my various vantage points. And it's what I find uniquely insightful. I found that it's the little moments that matter. I'm the luckiest person in the world for the chance to watch something so magical unfold from my vantage point. And it's what I find uniquely insightful. I found that it's the little moments that matter. The game of football is played on a 100-yard field with a 60-minute game clock, but it's won before the whistle. And I look forward to showing you why.